This is episode 68 of the Why Not Me podcast. What is trauma? I'm your host, Danita Bremer. I'm a wife, mom, member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and a life coach. And in this podcast, we talk about how to overcome our internal obstacles to endure this life well. Okay, welcome back to the podcast. I just want to say that it is a cold, kind of snowy day today, and my energy is very low. So I'm going to try to have higher energy for you, but I too am human. First of all, let's start out with a review. And you guys, I don't have very many written reviews. I have a handful of ratings, but if you wouldn't mind going and giving me a written review and telling me what your favorite takeaway is, that will help me decide what kind of content to produce in the future. This review is by Rachel and Monica of Podcast You. And they said, this topic is so needed, and we are so proud of you for getting your show out into the world. So I say thank you to Rachel and Monica. This particular review was from last year, and I've even shifted a bit since then, but I think their words are still true, if not more so. This topic is so needed. What is trauma? Last week, I talked about my journey to realizing how trauma was still affecting me at 40 years old. Now, one thing I don't know if I mentioned is that I know what trauma is. Like, I have a degree in psychology, but I think, like many of you and many people that I come in contact with, we tend to think that trauma is a traumatic event. Like, I went and fought in a war, or I was in a big car accident, or somebody tried to rape me, or whatever, right? And like many people that I have talked with, and several recently, one thing that I think in my journey that I didn't really realize is that trauma isn't just about those big events, right? And so I wasn't identifying as like I've had trauma, even though like logically, yes, I've had trauma in my life. I kind of was just thinking like, oh, I've overcome that, right? And so anyway, today I wanted to dive in a little bit more about what even is trauma. How do we define it? What are we actually talking about here? And this will probably end up being a series on trauma, but I do only take these episodes one at a time. So I don't have any plan in the future, although I have started to realize, oh, I could talk about this about trauma and this about trauma. So we'll see, but I don't know for sure. I have been learning from several different sources over the last, really in earnest, the last year, but probably even before that, the last couple of years, about what trauma is and what do we do about it and all of that. And before I get into the definition of trauma, I wanted to talk about our nervous system. I will drop a little picture in the show notes, but trauma really is about how your nervous system responds to threats or perceived threats. You don't actually have to be in a threatening situation or an unsafe situation. You just have to be perceiving it. And I have this great it's a screenshot, and I wish I could give credit to where credit is due, but I screenshotted this from one of the many classes or something that I went through. And I keep it on my desktop because I find that I actually refer to it fairly often to remind myself, and even to like, as I'm thinking about things, to understand with the nervous system what's going on. So we have kind of three different responses in our nervous system. The first is where we want to live and spend most of our time, which is in parasympathetic, or another word for that is ventral vagal. And if you've done any amount of reading or classes or anything, if you've been around the block a few times, Some of this terminology might be familiar and some might not be. So I'm going to try to use it all so that you can start connecting the dots in your mind. So this parasympathetic or ventral vagal state of being is where we feel connection and safety, and we're oriented to the environment. We're curious, we're open, we're compassionate, we're mindful, we have joy, we're grounded, and we're in the present, right? Our bodies work properly, our defense systems are down. That's kind of where we want to be. But we're human, and as humans, we operate just like animals in the world. And I'll get to that a little bit more a little later in the episode. So when we have a threat or something that signals to our brains this is not safe, we move into the sympathetic nervous system. This is the fight or flight kind of response. So for fight, we move toward the threat. We move into rage and anger and irritation and frustration. We get activated is another word that is often used in this sense. And with flight, fight is like, oh, I can conquer this threat. So we move into fight, and our chest and arms and head get activated. When we perceive a threat and we don't believe, and this is not like a conscious belief, but subconsciously we think, oh, I don't think I'll be able to take that threat. We move into flight, which is movement away from the threat. And this is seen as worry and concern or anxiety or fear or panic, but it's still activation, right? It's still like energy going into the system. Now, if the threat or the perceived threat is perceived as overwhelming, like I can neither fight it nor can I flee from it, we move into the freeze state or the dorsal vagal state. This is where we feel overwhelmed, we feel helpless, we feel maybe depression or numbness or dissociation, shame, shutdown, hopelessness, trapped. We prepare for death kind of thing. So these are sort of the three main ways that we tend to think of our nervous system. And the interesting thing is that when we're in the ventral vagal, the social engagement, open, curious, present, grounded state where we want to be, and then we move into a defensive mode, which both sympathetic and dorsal vagal, the fight, flight, or freeze responses, and we don't have on this particular diagram, it doesn't show the fawn response, but I would probably put that somewhere in between fight and flight and the freeze. I'm not quite sure if that's a sympathetic or if that's like a freeze response. Both of these responses are in relation to how do I get away or how do I deal with this threat? And if we get activated, fight or flight, and then we get overwhelmed, we go into freeze. The interesting thing that I think that I've learned is that in order to come out of freeze, we often have to go back through the activated state. We have to go back through the panic and the fear and the anxiety and the worry and the anger and the irritation and the frustration. That's part of the deactivation and getting back into ventral vagal. Okay, so that was a lot of words, a lot of big words. Like I said, I'll put that diagram in the show notes. Just as sort of a starting point about our nervous system is our brain and all of the nerves. We have one kind of big main nerve, the vagus nerve, that runs from our brainstem down our body into our gut, and then everything branches off from that. So your body is meant to collect information from the environment and to assess whether the information seems threatening or not. It's always sifting for, is this safe? Is this safe? Is this safe? I think of this as our natural man state, is like always on alert, always looking, am I safe? Is there danger? What's going on? And we don't want to be there, right? We want to be in this like calm, creative space. So just because our nervous system gets activated doesn't mean that we are experiencing trauma. But trauma does happen when our nervous system gets activated, right? So if you think of a Venn diagram, there's the nervous system activation, different phases of activation, and then there's trauma, and where they overlap is what trauma is, right? That doesn't make sense. There would be nervous system activation, and there would be things in the environment, and where they overlap, that is trauma, right? Where, and also the other thing about trauma is that it normally, like if we look at the animal kingdom, we perceive some threat, we get activated, we get away from the threat, and then we come down. So it's like this stress cycle, right? We go into activation and then we come out of activation, assuming we don't die. Trauma is when we don't get out of that stress cycle. We get into the activation and then it gets cut off somehow, and we don't get to resolve the cycle. So I'm going to talk about some of the people that I've learned from. The first one is Gabor Mate. And this is not in order of who I learned from first, second, third. It's just in order of kind of how I think of trauma and the definition of trauma as we're describing it here today. So one of the biggest things I learned from Gabor Mate is how he describes or defines trauma. And he says, trauma is what happens on the inside of you when something happens on the outside of you. So trauma is very much what is the going on internally to our nervous system when something happens outside of us. Now, this is a little bit confusing because it kind of makes it seem like something on the outside of us has to be big and traumatic, right? It has to be like a big thing, but it doesn't necessarily. If something happens on the outside of you, like, maybe you come home and your mom is in bed and sad, and you do that every day for a month. Now, that's not something that happens really to you. That's more something that you're witnessing. Still, it's kind of happening to you, but that could be traumatic. It doesn't matter how big or small the thing is. If somebody one time told you your shoes are ugly, could be traumatic. It really has nothing to do with the external event. It has way more to do with the internal events. Okay, the second person that I've learned from about trauma is Sarah Payton. And I've mentioned, I think, all of these people in the last episode as well. Sarah Payton, I don't even know what she calls herself, but she speaks a lot about trauma and depression and those kinds of things. And she is oriented toward the neurobiology part of this. And one thing that I've really learned from Sarah Payton about the definition of trauma is that when something on the outside of us happens and we experience alarmed aloneness, we're alone in the experience. We have nobody to support us or to teach us or to help, redefine things. That's a big part of trauma, is this alarmed aloneness, there's an alarm bell going off inside of me and I have nobody. So that is an element of it. Before I move on to Peter Levine and his book, Waking the Tiger, which for me has been the best resource for really understanding trauma on a biological, what's going on in your body kind of level, I wanted to just speak a moment about the book, What Happened to You by Oprah Winfrey and Bruce D. Perry. Dr. Perry is a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist specializing in childhood trauma. And of course, Oprah Winfrey has taken on an interest of how do we deal with childhood trauma and adverse conditions and things like that. And it's a fabulous book, but I went back to peruse it to see if they defined trauma, and they really didn't define it. And then the other book I flipped through was Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is also a fantastic resource. And I spent several minutes looking for, does he define trauma? And he really doesn't, which I think is so interesting. It's almost like there's this word in our cultural, knowledge base, but we don't necessarily have a definition that we're all coming to figuring out trauma on the same level, right? So I just thought that was really interesting. Um, both of these books, What Happened to You and The Body Keeps the Score, really approach the teaching of trauma and how to deal with trauma from like a story perspective. I highly recommend both of those books. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about Peter Levine's Waking the Tiger. And Peter Levine, as far as I know, I haven't read any of his other resources, but he has several books. He is one of the experts around trauma in this industry. And he really approaches it in terms of thinking about trauma in terms of like the animal world and how animals deal with trauma, and how as humans, we are also animals. And sometimes our thinking brain, the part of our brain that is more evolved than the rest of the animals in the animal kingdom, can thwart our body's wisdom and knowledge and natural inclination to move through trauma. So Peter Levine defines trauma as any unresolved autonomic nervous system response. And, that's kind of technical. So it's about, and I'm quoting here, it's about the nervous system's response to an event, not necessarily the event itself. Events can affect us, each of us, very differently. So that's why things affect us differently. Like, it's not really about the actual event, because if it was, then everybody who was in the same car accident would have the same trauma, right? Or everybody that witnesses the same event would all come at it the same way. But everybody comes at it differently depending on our different levels of sensitivity and our understanding and our personalities and our previous life experiences, all of that, right? So, I read an article that was by someone named Molson, last name Molson, and it said this: in a normal response to trauma, the body is able to reestablish its equilibrium as a person moves through a process where they can recover their lost power and recognize that the stressful event is in the past. Through the normal physiological responses of the body of shaking and trembling, traumatic energy is released and the autonomic nervous system is able to return to a normal state. Author Molson quotes Avadon Larson, a certified somatic experiencing practitioner and craniosacral therapy provider. Quote, what can make people susceptible to trauma is a previous history of trauma that has been unresolved. It's not the only thing, but one of the main things we see over and over. Traumas tend to stack on one another. And just like any other compensation pattern, we can compensate until we can't. I just really liked that kind of succinct description. I also wanted to read a little bit from the Waking the Tiger book. So the book is called Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma by Peter A. Levine with Anne Frederick. And to be honest, I haven't even finished this book. I picked it up and I started reading it several months ago, and then I got a little bit overwhelmed by it. And so I put it back down. And then just in the last few weeks, I've picked it up again and I've kind of been reading it chunk by chunk. So I'm taking it really slowly because I really want to understand these concepts, and I don't want to just read for learning's sake. I want to put things into practice. And that's what I find I do when I come across a really good resource. I usually consume it very slowly. So I just wanted to read this. It is a little lengthy, so I apologize for that, but it's so good. It so encapsulates kind of the idea of trauma. A herd of impala grazes peacefully in a lush wadi. Suddenly, the wind shifts, carrying with it a new but familiar scent. The impala sense danger in the air and become instantly tensed to a hair trigger of alertness. They sniff, Look and listen carefully for a few moments, but when no threat appears, the animals return to their grazing, relaxed yet vigilant. Seizing the moment, a stalking cheetah leaps from its cover of dense shrubbery. As if it were one organism, the herd springs quickly toward a protective thicket at the wadi's edge. One young impala trips for a split second, then recovers, but it is too late. In a blur, the cheetah lunges toward its intended victim, and the chase is on at a blazing 60 to 70 miles an hour. At the moment of contact, or just before, the young impala falls to the ground, surrendering to its impending death. Yet it may be uninjured. The stone still animal is not pretending to be dead. It has instinctively entered an altered state of consciousness shared by all mammals when death appears imminent. Many indigenous peoples view this phenomenon as a surrender of the spirit of the prey to the predator, which, in a manner of speaking, it is. Physiologists call this altered state the immobility or freezing response. It is one of the three primary responses available to reptiles and mammals when faced with an overwhelming threat. The other two, fight and flight, are much more familiar to most of us. Less is known about the immobility response. However, my work over the last 25 years has led me to believe that it is the single most important factor in uncovering the mystery of human trauma. Nature has developed the immobility response for two good reasons. One, it serves as a last-ditch survival strategy. You might know it better as playing possum. Take the young impala, for instance. There's a possibility that the cheetah may decide to drag its quote-unquote dead prey to a place safe from the other predators, or to its lair, where the food can be shared later with its cubs. During this time, the impala could awaken from its frozen state and make a hasty escape in an unguarded moment. When it is out of danger, the animal will literally shake off the residual effects of the immobility response and gain full control of its body. It will then return to its normal life as if nothing had happened. Secondly, in freezing, the impala and human enters an altered state in which no pain is experienced. What that means for the impala is that it will not have to suffer while being torn apart by the cheetah's sharp teeth and claws. Most modern cultures tend to judge this instinctive surrender in the face of overwhelming threat as a weakness tantamount to cowardice. However, underneath this judgment lies a deep human fear of immobility. We avoid it because it is a state very similar to death. This avoidance is understandable, but we pay dearly for it. The physiological evidence clearly shows that the ability to go into and come out of this natural response is the key to avoiding the debilitating effects of trauma. It is a gift to us from the wild. I loved that. I love the picture that paints. It helped me really understand what the freeze response really is and why it is adaptable, right? From like an animal perspective. And then I wanted to read just another short section because it's talking about the event versus the external event versus the internal event. And it says, traumatic symptoms are not caused by the triggering event itself. They stem from the frozen residue of energy that has not been resolved and discharged. This residue remains trapped in the nervous system where it can wreak havoc on our bodies and spirits. The long-term, alarming, debilitating, and often bizarre symptoms of PTSD develop when we cannot complete the process of moving in, through, and out of the immobility or freezing state. However, we can thaw by initiating and encouraging our innate drive to return to a state of dynamic equilibrium. Let's cut to the chase. The energy in our young impala's nervous system as it flees from the pursuing cheetah is charged at 70 miles an hour. The moment the cheetah takes its final lunge, the impala collapses. From the outside, it looks motionless and appears to be dead, but inside, its nervous system is still supercharged at 70 miles an hour. Though it has come to a dead stop, what is now taking place in the impala's body is similar to what occurs if you're in your car if you floor the accelerator and stomp on the brakes simultaneously. The difference between the inner racing of the nervous system, the engine, and the outer immobility, the brake, of the body creates a forceful turbulence inside the body similar to a tornado. This tornado of energy is the focal point out of which form the symptoms of traumatic stress. To help visualize the power of this energy, I'm going to stop there. But the point is that there's all of this energy that floods your system. And then when you become immobilized, like the impala, it just dead stop, right? So where does that energy go? And what these resources talk about, the body keeps the score, your resonant self, waking the tiger, what happened to you, all these books submit that the energy has to go somewhere. So we hold onto it and it comes out as the symptoms of trauma. And that could look a million different ways. In fact, I was just reading about these lists of the symptoms of trauma. It could be panic attacks, anxiety, phobias, mental blankness or spaciness, an exaggerated startle response, extreme sensitivity to light and sound, hyperactivity, exaggerated emotional responses, nightmares, night terrors, avoidance behavior, attraction to dangerous situations, frequent crying, abrupt mood swings, amnesia, forgetfulness, inability to love, nurture, bond with other individuals, fear of dying, fear of going crazy or having to shorten life, reduced ability to deal with stress, like you're easily stressed out, difficulty with sleep. The list goes on, right? But if you listen to those symptoms, pretty much every human I know deals with these symptoms, right? So that's like basically what trauma is. It's this stress response that gets thwarted somehow, or we can't fully resolve it or understand it. So then our body keeps on trying to resolve it or trying to replay it to come to a resolution, right? So we see this, for example, in dynamics that we have seen in our childhood. Maybe the easiest example is through our parents. So if we watch our parents fighting constantly all the time, the normal natural thing is to want to help, to want to like, how can we fix this? Right. But when you're a young child and you don't have any resources to be able to quote unquote fix it, you just feel so helpless and you get stressed, like, oh, parents are fighting again, but then you can't do anything about it. There's no action that you can take because you're a young child, right? And maybe you don't even understand it. So you just get stuck in this like frozen, like, I want to help, but I don't know what to do. And I am speaking from experience here. And so then years later, when you have your own children, you fight with them, right? You're like, this is what we do when we're in a family, we fight and argue with each other. And I don't know how to not do that. And it might be a subconscious response to replay what you've seen as a child to get some resolution from it. And that is what therapy and coaching and all these different modalities are meant to help with. They're meant to help with coming to a resolution from all of this pent up energy or stress or whatever it is. And it's not conscious. That's the thing, is it's not like you're consciously thinking, I think I'm going to fight with my kids today. I think I'm going to yell at my kids today, right? It's a subconscious, like very subtle cues from the environment that trigger, oh, this is the part where we argue or we fight or we yell, right? Unless we have the awareness and the resources to come to those situations with more compassion and patience and all of that, right? So that is kind of how I think of trauma. It's like stored up stress or fear. Oftentimes for me, it's fear. It's like, I feel afraid, but I'm not sure why I feel afraid. It's just like my body feels afraid. Or for me, also a common one is feeling sad. Now, one thing that I have noticed is that at first I would say anytime tears came up that I was sad, and I have plenty of things to be sad about, right? But now I recently, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, had an experience where I felt the tears come up. I felt like crying, but when I was really thinking about and feeling into my body and what emotion is this, it didn't feel like sadness. It felt like fear, right? And so oftentimes tears are just an automatic response, kind of like shaking, how it was like if the impala were to get away, it would shake off all of that energy, right? And they would go back right to what it was doing before. So tears tend to be a sign that just something is at the surface, and it doesn't necessarily have to be sadness. And I'm learning now that tears come up when I feel overwhelmed, tears come up when I feel fear, tears come up when I feel sad, tears come up when I feel angry, tears come up when I feel helpless. Probably more, but those are the things I've noticed, right? So if you find yourself crying a lot, I tend to think that's a good sign. That's like a sign that your body is ready to process. Not always, it's not always true, but I often with my clients, they apologize for their tears. And I'm like, no, don't apologize. This is a good thing. This is your body responding to whatever's here. Let's find out what's here. I have been working with a coach, Shyla Cash. And if you want to find out more about her, go to shylacash.com. She's a fantastic one-on-one coach. She has some other offerings throughout the year as well. She does have a podcast and she does coaching. So she has just been a lifesaver for me, a blessing, an answer to prayer. She has worked with me. Let's see, we've been working together since last October. So almost 6 months now. And almost all of our work that we do together is based off of Peter Levine's program, Somatic Experiencing, where we just look at what's happening in my body. And then she helps to guide me and asks me questions and things like that. And the power of this, it is so simple, yet as humans, we so desperately want to be in our minds and use our intellect and our thoughts that we don't slow down to be in our bodies and to be really curious and open about what's happening in my body. And the other thing I will say, especially if you're a coach listening to this, or if you have had experience with the coaching industry and the mindset world, something we learn about is resistance. And resistance often feels like tightness in our necks, in our shoulders, any kind of tightness really. But specifically, I find that resistance for me is that feeling of like bringing my shoulders up to my ears and just kind of like tightening up into a ball. And we learn that resistance blocks us. And so the first step is often trying to soften the resistance, trying to lean into the resistance, let go of the resistance. But what I've been learning from Shyla is that there's a reason why we're in resistance. And sometimes we have to allow the resistance, like go fully more into the resistance in order to have a true release. And so it's partly just like your body has so much wisdom. Gabor Mate's video, his documentary it's called The Wisdom of Trauma. And Bessel van der Kolk, his book is The Body Keeps the Score. It's this idea that your body holds like a record of all of your traumas. And whatever your body is doing, there's a good reason for it. So part of this, what I want to just offer for you today is to not judge your body. If you're often in like a fight response, in the like yelling, activated anger, irritation response, there's a reason for that. If you're like me and you're in the shutdown response, in the freeze response, there's a reason for that. So it was really easy for me to be like, I don't want to be in freeze anymore. I want to get through this. I want to get over this. But I almost had to go deeper into like the natural movements that our bodies make when we're in freeze response. And being in freeze response doesn't mean like I didn't couldn't do anything. Like I still have a pretty normal functional life, right? Like I'm cooking dinner and I'm folding laundry and I'm getting my kid from school and I'm running my business. Like all of that is happening while my nervous system tends to go into shutdown. All that means is that my nervous system prefers the kind of shame, hopelessness, helplessness, dissociation. And I'll probably do an episode on dissociation all by itself because it's something that I think is misunderstood. That's where my body likes to live, kind of in that neighborhood, so to speak. My body does not like to go toward anger. And maybe that's because I'm a woman and I'm socialized as a woman. And oftentimes women are like socialized to believe that anger is not okay for women. It's only okay for men. I think that's an element of it. But I had to allow myself to tense more, to follow the urges before I had some kind of pivotal openings in what I felt was going on in my body. Okay, that is a lot. That's sort of my definitions of trauma. I'm sure you have questions. Come over to my brand new website. I am so excited. I have a new website that I've been working with a team on, and I think it's live. I'm recording this on March 30th, and it will be live by Monday when this episode drops. And if for some reason it's not live, then it will be very shortly. And it talks a lot about trauma on my website. And I have a new PDF. It might be trauma if, and these are the top 5 kind of trauma, quote unquote, trauma responses that I see my clients have that they don't even know might be from trauma. I'm going to give you one little peek, which is, do you always feel like you're in a rush or in a hurry, or you have to stay busy, or you have to stay productive? That might be a trauma response. Think about it. Kids who are in that ventral vagal, that creative, calm space, their nervous system is not activated. They're hardly ever in a rush. They don't understand we have to be at school by 8:32 when the bell rings, right? And so I have some theories forming, but I kind of think that if we're always in a rush and if we always like, quote unquote, need to be productive and we have a hard time relaxing, that it's actually a flight response. It's a trauma response trying to get us to flee from any emotions that feel uncomfortable or dangerous. So that's a little preview. So if you have questions, go on over to my website, danitabremmer.com, and there's a new page that's a contact form. And you can just basically contact me and ask me whatever questions you have, and it's great. And I don't even quite know how it works. I'm assuming it goes to my email, and then I will respond to you. I will be leaving social media in mid-April. And so that is not a good place to go to DM me or comment. I really want you to reach out over email or through my website, or if you want, find me on Voxer. It's a little walkie-talkie app. It's an orange walkie-talkie in the App Store if you're not familiar with it. Come talk to me, totally free. I've just decided that I love Voxer and I love getting to know people. And that's a way that I would love to have a free offering. This podcast is a free offering, and now Voxer is a free offering. So if you want to come over to Voxer and not go all the way to my website, I totally understand. My handle on Voxer is just Danita Bremmer, no spaces, no punctuation. So come chat with me. Come go check out my new website, click all the buttons. Tell me if anything doesn't work for you or if anything looks funky or weird for you. I would love that. I would so appreciate that. And let me know what questions you have about trauma, and I will do some specific episodes about your questions. And if you have questions that I can't answer, I will do some research and I will point you in the right direction. That's enough for now, and so are you. If this episode made you think about yourself or others in a new way, would you please give it a rating and a review or share it with a friend? And if you're ready to overcome your internal obstacles and show up to this human experience as your highest self, go to danitabremmer.com and schedule a free session with me. Until next time, go be you and follow the spirit.